you for having me. Today I'm going to talk about cooperatives and their effect on regional labor market performance. This is a panel data analysis of Italian regions. And maybe my starting point for this presentation is going to be, how I got started with this topic. I have this book here. It's Economics for the Many. It's essentially a political manifesto that I read quite a while ago. And it was talking, it's edited by John McDonnell, the UK Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, during the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, so the left wing of the Labour Party. And he was mentioning that an economy for the many can only be achieved really if you broaden the ownership. And that means engaging with a series of actors, but more prominently expanding the worker control and the cooperative sector. I already kind of had a small knowledge about the cooperative movement. And so that's where I kind of snowballed and kind of started research and went into the topic. And today I'm gonna give you a little bit of an introduction to what I'm talking about, the three hypotheses that I'm investigating, first findings and next steps. Okay, so as everything, I had to start with a literature review. In my case, I started with defining a cooperative. It's important in this case because you had very different definitions out there in the academia. They were referring to a cooperative with the names of social enterprises or non-profit enterprises, but they were still referring to the same concept essentially, and that is that you have these two main elements. The first one is that a cooperative has a democratic ownership, so the workers are also owners of the company and they have a say over the decision-making processes. And the second one is that there is this mutuality aspect, so that cooperatives as organizations tend to cater to the needs of their members. And then from there, I took it one step further and tried to analyze, what is the economic performance of these cooperatives? So do they actually kind of achieve these economics for the many that the guy John McDonnell was talking about? And here you really see two schools of thought in this regard. The first one is also chronologically the one that comes first, and that is from Ward's seminal article, and he describes cooperatives as this inefficient economic rent for labor. So the idea is that cooperatives are not really able to produce value and produce goods and services. It's just a way for the workers to stay and have some salary up until the company is no longer viable. It has this very cynical view of the cooperatives. And then the second school of thought, which is also more recent, tries to understand cooperatives as better equipped at protecting employment during economic downturns. And it does so because of the structure in itself. So workers are also owners, so there's this democratic legitimacy in the decisions that they take. And then the second thing is that during economic downturns, the way that cooperatives tackle them is by not by firing people, but by reducing the wages, so the wage level. And from there, I wanted to understand, okay, but so is this really the case? Because the literature that is out there is just very much about, either the ideological movement behind the cooperatives, or about models and the stylization of the concept, but no real concrete evidence out there. And so this is where my research question came in. So I wanted to understand what was the effect of the presence of cooperatives on the labor market performance. So are they really able to prevent unemployment? Are they really able to produce better labor market outcomes? And the way I'm trying to, first of all, before going into that, I wanted to go at first with European regions. The NUTS, I don't know how familiar you are with this, but essentially the countries are divided into regional levels, statistically speaking. But that was not possible because data availability was an issue. So be very careful of how much data you have and what is the level of level of presence there. for the theoretical framework, what was my idea behind this? So I started reading a little bit more about this, and cooperatives are associated with a more egalitarian distribution of wages, and the surplus that they make in terms of what is a profit, but not really, because they're not really profit-seeking organizations. What I was saying, that profit is reinvested in the workforce professional development. And then they are also associated with a stronger or tighter economic fabric of communities, because they invest in social projects that are linked to those communities. They have scholarships, grants, those kind of elements that tie the community together. And surprisingly enough for me, they're also associated with better healthcare indicators. So the idea there is that cooperatives are, the positives below there is that they are better equipped at having protecting work-life balance, and because of that, people have like less mortality and they have a longer life expectancy. And so all of these externalities kind of come together, and through the dynamics of supply and demand of the labor market, they also push the equilibrium of the other companies, the ones that are non-cooperatives, the traditional firms, towards a better working conditions, essentially. The research model, I don't know how many of you guys are doing SAS2, but this is a DAG, a directed acyclical graph. And the idea is that I have the presence of cooperatives as an explanatory variable, and the labor market performance as an outcome of interest, and then three confounders: the economic performance, the social services provision, and the education performance. My biggest problem like a month ago was this sex variable, because I was struggling due to the dual nature that I kind of highlighted there. It's yet a confounder, but also a moderator. And I was having trouble justifying it or also implementing it in terms of regressions, but you will see that it actually works out later on. And the three hypotheses that I had rely on one single explanatory variable. So a higher employment level in cooperatives with respect to the traditional firms lead to outcomes of interest being higher employment rates, total and by sex, lower unemployment rates, total and by sex, and lower inactivity rates, total and by sex. And now we will look into this a little bit deeper. So for the first one, higher employment levels in cooperatives lead to higher employment rates. I had this panel data regression. You just see the simplified version of this, but I was looking at Italian regions over a period of time from 2012 to 2018. And I've highlighted the coefficients that are important here for the discussion. So when you look at the total employment rate, so the first model, the cooperative employment level is positive, so compliant with the expectations, but not statistically significant. And then when you divide it, and look at the moderation effects by sex, it's interesting because the coefficient becomes much more positive. So still compliant with the expectations and also statistically significant for men in the labor market. But it goes all the other way around, so negative and without statistically significance for women in the labor market. And this is for the employment rate. But the same kind of story also goes for the unemployment and inactivity rates. In this second hypothesis, I'm looking at higher employment levels in cooperatives lead to lower unemployment rates. And once again, you see that the story is kind of similar, even though for the male rates, I don't have the statistical significance at the 0.05 level. But the total is still not statistically significant. Total and male rates are compliant with the expectations that cooperatives reduce the unemployment rate, but then the female one kind of goes the other way around. And for the inactivity rates, higher employment levels in cooperatives lead to lower inactivity rates. That's also there, same story as before. It just changes a little bit for the total inactivity rate. So what were my first findings here? I was struggling because you had, this evidence that was just impartial support of the first and third hypothesis. So I had some support in the sense that the cooperative employment level really increases employment and activity rates, but only for men and not for women, and not on the total rates. And so you really see this moderation effect by sex, right? And the idea there is that you have to, at least I still have to take it one step further to understand how to explain, this first finding. So how to justify these differences with the women, with the female coefficients, because they're not statistically significant and they're contrary to expectations. So what I'm going to do in the next couple of weeks is to include this sector of activity, another confounding variable to understand. So I'm going to differentiate the cooperative employment level by sectors. So agriculture, manufacturing, and services, broadly speaking. And the idea there, maybe I can explain it without going into the literature, just with the example of the COVID-19 pandemic. Because we've seen that in relation to the pandemic, we had a higher burden on women because they were mostly employed in the services sector, and especially in those sectors that were subject to restrictions and lockdown and closures and so on. So what would be my expectation is that for the services sector, I would still find that kind of noise, and not statistically significant, but then maybe what I'm trying to look at is whether for the manufacturing sector, having a higher cooperative level of employment in this territory might actually produce a positive or a least compliant and statistically significant coefficient.